I went to dinner with coworkers and saw my wife toasting with her boss at the next table, laughing as if the world were too light to remember I existed. I felt my face burn, got up, and left without saying a word. My silence was the end. And that's how everything began to die. I didn't scream, didn't cause a scene, didn't ask for an explanation. Because I already knew. I'd already felt the silent distance, the lukewarm touch, the gazes that no longer met. But until that moment, there was a silent hope within me, a thread of illusion that perhaps I was exaggerating, perhaps it was all fatigue, routine, weariness. But when I saw her laughing like that, as if she were a teenager discovering her first love, as if the whole world were made only of possibilities and she were free of any ties, any memories, any commitments, I understood there was no longer room for me there. In that laugh, in that toast, in that look she offered another man, him of all people, with the lightness of someone who has erased everything we've lived. I don't know how long I stood there, watching. My colleagues around me talked, toasted, smiled, but my soul had stopped. It was as if time had slowed down just to force me to watch every second of that cruel spectacle. I wondered if she saw me. She didn't. Because those who love notice. Those who love, feel. Those who love never forget to look to the side, to remember the other's existence. And in that moment, she seemed too free to remember I existed. And worst of all the possible reactions I imagined having upon catching someone cheating, I never imagined it would be silence. The dry silence of someone who has crumbled inside and has already understood that there is nothing that can be said to erase what was felt. I didn't pursue her. I didn't call, I didn't text. I didn't ask anything. I slept away from home that night. And when I returned, days later, I had already made the only possible decision. Love doesn't die with a scream. It dies with contempt. And when you realize you've been forgotten, ignored, replaced, not by another body, but by another connection, you understand that what hurt wasn't the physical betrayal, it was the betrayal of memory. I was part of her life, part of her day, her story, her past, and yet, in that restaurant, I was a stranger. And that hurt more than any hidden kiss, any deleted message, any lie. It hurt because it showed how irrelevant I'd become to someone who meant everything to me. The absence of scandal was my final act of love. It was my final gift, the right to leave with dignity. She didn't find out that day. She called me, texted me. It took me days to respond. When I did, it was with a short sentence, "I saw you." And there was no more conversation. She tried again. She said it wasn't what it seemed, that it was just dinner, that he was just a friend, that she was going through a rough patch, that she needed space, that she felt my distance, as if my emotional absence justified her body in the arms of another. But there was no more room for justification. Because betrayal doesn't begin with touching. It begins when you stop caring for what you've built. When you look at someone else as if that other person were what your partner stopped being, without even trying to recover what was lost. She thought she was experiencing something new. Maybe she was. But new doesn't mean better. And sometimes new is only light because it doesn't yet carry the weight of truth, responsibility, and true surrender. What she experienced with him felt like passion, but it was just an illusion. An illusion that crumbled over time, when desire became routine, when conversation became demands, when the novelty lost its luster. She discovered that what felt like connection was just ego massage, what felt like freedom was just camouflaged need, and what felt like romance was just escape. And when she finally looked away, there was no one else. Because he didn't stay. He didn't promise to stay. He didn't fight. He just passed by. Meanwhile, I carried on. I carried on through pain, through anger, through sleepless nights, and through silences that screamed louder than any argument. But I carried on. And little by little, I rediscovered who I was before the disappointment. The pain transformed me, but it didn't harden me. Because, as contradictory as it may seem, when you're betrayed by the one you love, you begin to value even more the importance of someone who truly chooses you. And true love arrived. It arrived when I no longer expected it. It arrived calmly, truthfully, and presently. It arrived with eyes that didn't look away, with words that didn't hurt, with actions that left no doubt. And when it returned, because those who betray always return, it was too late. She came to me months later, with a blank look in her eyes, a sincere but belated apology. She said she regretted it, that she felt lost, that she now understood what she had done, that she was alone, that everything she had experienced was a lie. I believed her. I believed in the regret, the pain, the guilt. But I didn't go back. Because forgiveness isn't a return. Forgiveness is liberation. And I did forgive her. But only to bury what hurt, not to resurrect what was no more. She understood that day that some choices cannot be undone. That some mistakes cannot be undone. That sometimes, the price of misused freedom is eternal loneliness. The cruelest thing of all is that she saw with her own eyes what she lost. She saw the way I looked at another woman, the same way I once looked at her. She saw the way I smiled lightly, the lightness that was once hers. She saw that the true love she scorned blossomed in another heart. And she understood that the silence I maintained that night in the restaurant wasn't cowardice. It was grief. The grief of someone who loved enough not to beg for scraps. And when she finally tried to rescue me, she found a whole man, but too whole to fit back into that broken space she'd left behind. She tried to rebuild something with what was left. She tried to convince herself that she could go back to being who we were. She tried to romanticize the past, remember the trips, the promises, the plans. But all paths back were closed. Because it's not just about remembering what we lived. It's about remembering who we were. And she was no longer the woman I once loved. And I was no longer the man she thought would always be there. And that's when the sandcastle finally came crashing down. Her lover left her. The relationship didn't even survive the first storm. And over time, she realized that everything she'd experienced with him was too shallow to fill the void he'd left. She tried to move on, tried to reinvent herself, tried to cling to new distractions. But each new beginning brought with it the ghost of what she'd lost. Because true love is never forgotten. True love cannot be replaced. True love hurts when it ends, and bleeds when it's wasted. And then, on any given night, in any given place, she saw me with my new partner. She saw me smiling in a way she hadn't seen in years. She saw me at peace. And she understood. She understood that she was no longer part of my life, nor of my pain. She understood that her love, the love I once desired so much, no longer served me. And that's where the story takes on its true weight. Because punishment doesn't always come in screams. Sometimes it comes in silence. In looks that don't recognize. In longing that finds no destination. But what she never imagined, is that the woman I was rebuilt for, was already crossing our path when everything began to fall apart. And if she had looked closer, maybe she would have noticed. Maybe I would have understood sooner. Maybe I would have made a different choice. But now, it was too late. And what happened next, nobody expected it. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal isn't romanticized, it's exposed. No form of infidelity is justified, and our fictional stories exist to show, with emotion and realism, how betrayal destroys lives, erodes trust, and leaves scars that even time can't erase. Now prepare to dive into an intense, shocking, and unforgettable story. Take a deep breath. The truth hurts, and it's about to begin. His name was Daniel, and at 35, he carried in his eyes the serenity of someone who deeply believed in the value of their word. He had a discreet smile, a calm way of listening, and a certain melancholy in the depths of his voice that made his words always seem more profound than they were. He wasn't the kind of man who imposed himself through excess, but through constancy. He was the kind who remembers dates, who pays attention to details, who memorizes the names of the friends of the woman he loves. Who goes to the supermarket with a list and returns with flowers? Who argues in silence, and loves in silence too? He never needed to be loud to be noticed, and perhaps because of that, he was exactly the kind of man she believed she could love for a lifetime. Her name was Laura, and there was something in her eyes that always seemed to be searching for more. She was beautiful in a subtle way, the kind of beauty that requires no effort, because it's made of expression, intelligence, and presence. She's worked in events for years, is articulate, determined, has a keen aesthetic sense, likes to talk about everything, but, above all, likes to feel alive. Laura has always been intense, not in the impulsive sense, but in the sense that she lived each thing with total abandon. When she loved, it was completely. When she was hurt, it hurt deeply. And when she smiled, it was impossible not to smile along with her. She met Daniel at a gathering of friends, introduced by a mutual friend who swore they were perfectly suited. And they were, indeed. He was stable. She was radiance. He was roots. She, wind. But for the first 2 years, that wasn't a problem. It was precisely the contrast that made them work. They began dating calmly, as if they wanted to get it right. Daniel was only 4 years older than Laura, but with an emotional difference that made him almost a safe haven. She, accustomed to turbulent relationships and men who disappeared for days at a time, found herself involved for the first time with someone who truly stayed. Who responded to her messages with affection. Who called to check on her arrival. Who wanted to meet her parents, her favorite books, her childhood. And that disarmed her. She surrendered to him as if she had finally found what she had been searching for years. They were different, yes, but they built a relationship based on listening. He gave in to the parties she insisted on going to, she accepted the lazy Sundays at home with popcorn and old movies. He learned to deal with her intensity. She learned to trust his calm. And when they decided to move in together, 3 years after they started dating, it was like signing a silent contract of true commitment. The house was small, but alive. Every corner held memories. From the first armchair she'd bought at a thrift store to the crooked painting on the wall she insisted on leaving there because, she said, it gave the room character. The routine took shape naturally. Daniel woke up early, drank coffee while reading the news on his phone. Laura was always 10 minutes late, coming into the kitchen with her hair tied up messily and a sleepy, good morning, that he found adorable. On weekends, they alternated between visiting his parents and hers, having dinner with friends, going to the park, binge-watching TV shows, and petty arguments about who would do the dishes. Everyday life filled the spaces, and love, though quieter over time, seemed firm. Stable. Present. Of course, not everything was perfect. Over time, Laura began to feel herself shrinking. Not because of Daniel, he never stopped her from anything, but because of the life she herself had chosen to live. The events, the clients, the deadlines, the busy weekends. Little by little, she began to miss something she couldn't name. A restlessness that didn't stem from a crisis, but from a strange feeling that she was too stagnant, too predictable. She began seeking new courses, becoming more involved with her work team, accepting invitations to events even when she didn't need to be. Daniel noticed, but didn't confront her. He trusted her. And because he trusted her so much, he didn't approach her to try to understand. Laura, for her part, felt guilty about this silent distance. She loved Daniel. She still did. But love now seemed to have changed color. It was no longer bright red, but more beige, more sober, calmer. And she, without realizing it, began to confuse calm with absence. She began to wonder if she hadn't lost something inside herself. Conversations with friends were increasingly filled with doubts. Is this normal? Is this just a phase? Is love always like this after a while? No one had answers. But the questions began to echo loudly within her. Daniel felt it. He'd always been sensitive to the world around him. He sensed that Laura smiled less at home, that she was more impatient, more absent during dinners for two. He sensed that she took longer to respond to messages during the day, that she no longer commented on plans as before. But he also didn't want to be intrusive. He believed that sometimes the best way to love was to give space. And perhaps that was his mistake. Because Laura didn't just need space, she needed presence. A listening ear. A confrontation. Someone to say, "You're changing, and that worries me." But Daniel was the kind of man who preferred to wait for someone to talk rather than press. He believed that time would bring answers. But time, sometimes, takes with it what could still be saved. Gradually, the two began to live in parallel layers. They lived together, yes. They still liked each other, still respected each other, still cared. But they no longer connected with each other with the same depth. The kisses became quicker, the hugs more automatic. The dinners became quieter. The messages more formal. It was as if their love had begun to lose its breath, but neither of them knew how to perform mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And then life went on. As it always does. With birthdays celebrated with hastily purchased cake, with trips postponed due to commitments, with promises that, next week, they would have more time. But the time never came. And it was in this scenario that things began to fall apart, without anyone deliberately destroying anything. Love didn't end all at once. It faded slowly, slipping through the cracks of routine, escaping in silence, getting lost in misunderstandings. And yet, there was still a part of Daniel that believed. He still made plans. He thought about children. A bigger house. Renovating the porch. Writing a book to dedicate to her. Laura, on the other hand, lived on a tightrope between what she still felt and what she thought she deserved to feel. She wanted intensity. But she didn't know that sometimes true intensity lies in constancy. And what is too light to have roots is too light to support the weight of true love. Life continued at a cruelly normal pace. Anniversaries came and went with timid celebrations. Good morning messages were replaced by practical everyday reminders. Displays of affection became memories rather than routines. And yet, in everyone's eyes, they were an exemplary couple. They never fought in public. They were always in photos together. They laughed together when they were with friends. But only they knew of the gap that was beginning to grow between them like an empty space in the middle of the bed. And in that space, anything could enter. Including things neither of them was prepared to face. But cruelest of all, in the midst of this comfortable silence, something began to stir. Something that seemed small at first, but would gain enough strength to turn everything upside down. Something that would test the limits of trust, pain, and love. Something that would completely change the course of two lives that, for so long, seemed destined to grow old together. What neither of them knew was that love would survive the first crack, but perhaps not the next. And once the fine line between desire and loyalty was crossed, there would be no turning back. Laura started leaving work later. At first, she blamed it on extra demands, an important event coming up, an unexpected meeting that dragged on, bad traffic at the end of the day. Daniel suspected nothing. He trusted her with an almost innocent naturalness. He wasn't the kind of man who scrutinized his phone, investigated signals, or collected evidence. He believed that love was sustained by freedom, and so he didn't question it. When she arrived tired, he had already prepared something to eat, asked how her day was, and listened attentively. Laura, on the other hand, became increasingly reserved. She spoke less, was more easily distracted, and seemed to be irritated by pleasantries. Sometimes, she would stare at her plate in silence, as if she were absent from her own body. And Daniel, even noticing these signs, tried to convince himself that it was all due to stress, work exhaustion, the burden of daily life. He believed that couples go through phases like these, that love doesn't die just because the other person is silent. But there was something in her eyes that she could no longer fake. The text messages became cold reminders. "I'll be late, I have dinner with a client, you can sleep without me." Daniel always responded with understanding. He didn't demand anything. And perhaps because of that, Laura felt even more guilty. But she didn't stop. The excuses increased, and with them, the frequency with which she strayed from her home life. He began to sleep with his cell phone on silent, face down. He would emerge from the shower hurriedly responding to messages. He would receive calls in the middle of the night and answer them outside the bedroom. Her gaze was always elsewhere. And Daniel, even if he didn't want to admit it, began to feel the shadow that looms when trust is betrayed without words. That strange emptiness that appears when the other's presence no longer welcomes, but hurts. One sunny Saturday, she suggested a training course in another city. She said it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity she couldn't refuse. She packed her bags too quickly, left with a kiss on the forehead, and departed with subdued enthusiasm. Daniel spent the weekend in silence, trying to believe her excuse, but feeling that something had profoundly changed. It was that weekend that he began revisiting the last few weeks, the last gestures, the last silences. The pieces began to fit together in a way that hurt. It was as if he were looking at a puzzle he'd never wanted to put together. And there, for the first time, he felt real fear. Not fear of losing her. Fear of having already lost her and still pretending not to. On Monday, she returned with gifts. A book he'd wanted to read, a new t-shirt. She tried to act natural, like someone returning home after a normal trip. But there was a gleam in her eyes that wasn't longing, it was guilt disguised as effort. Daniel received everything kindly, but the hug didn't fit. The kiss was flavorless. And her scent was no longer the same. The body of someone who loves senses when it's being replaced. And even without proof, Daniel felt she was no longer there. She no longer asked if he slept well, didn't comment on his days, didn't share the little details, and it was in those details that love once resided. Their weekends together became increasingly rare. When they were in the same space, they felt like two strangers sharing a roof. The silence between them went from comfortable to deafening. Laura tried to stay present, but she could no longer hide the disconnect. She started sentences she didn't finish, looked at her phone more than she looked at his eyes. And when they went out together, it felt like she was counting down to somewhere else. Daniel, with his quiet sensitivity, began to crumble inside. But still, he believed. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of love. He still made plans, still left notes, still spoke fondly of her when he was with friends. But his eyes no longer smiled. It was a Thursday night that everything began to change irreversibly. A coworker of Daniel's organized an informal dinner with some team members. Laura wasn't going, she already had another commitment and said she was exhausted and needed a night to herself. Daniel understood, as he always did. He went to dinner lightly, trying to distract his mind, which was already racing. When he arrived at the restaurant, he greeted his colleagues, sat at the table, ordered a drink, and tried to disconnect. But when he looked up, something broke inside him. At the next table, Laura was toasting with another man. Her laughter was free, her gaze complicit. They were too close to be mere colleagues, too intimate to be mere friends. The touch of their hands was subtle, but present. The kind of gesture that only those who love, or desire, perceive. Daniel didn't need to see a kiss. He didn't need to hear confessions. In that instant, he knew. Everything I suspected took shape. Everything that hurt had a face. It wasn't just suspicion. It wasn't paranoia. It was real. The woman with whom he shared his life, his home, his plans, his history, was there, before him, living another story with another man. As if he didn't exist. As if everything they'd experienced had been a pause between two beginnings. He didn't get up immediately. He stood there for a few minutes, watching. Trying to understand where everything had gone wrong. At what point the smiles had stopped being for him. At what turn of the road she disconnected and he hadn't seen it. His heart was beating like an out-of-beat drum, his blood felt too hot, his hands too cold. The silence inside him was louder than any scream. Betrayal, at that moment, was no longer a possibility. It was a confirmation. And the cruelest thing of all was the way she laughed. She laughed as if she were weightless. Too weightless to remember that someone still carried the weight of loving her. Daniel stood up slowly. He didn't make a fuss, didn't approach. He left unnoticed, like a disappearing shadow. He left with the dignity of someone who chooses to suffer alone rather than beg for empty explanations. His silence was the end. Not because he didn't want to fight, but because he understood that those who love alone build nothing but pain. And he wasn't willing to be the only one holding a bridge that had already been burned on the other side. In the days that followed, Laura tried to act as if nothing had happened. She sent messages, tried to maintain her routine. Daniel, on the other hand, sank into absolute silence. He distanced himself. He didn't argue, didn't demand, didn't question. He simply remained silent. And this silence said it all. It said he had seen. That he had understood. That he had accepted the end, even though he hadn't chosen it. Laura felt the change, but she didn't know how much he knew. She tried to make conversation, to recapture what was left. But the connection was gone. And little by little, the weight of guilt began to manifest. What had once seemed light now hurt. What was new began to feel empty. And what she had left behind was beginning to show its value. But it was too late. Daniel was no longer the same. And when she tried to reach him, she realized she might never be able to again. I still didn't know what he knew. I still didn't understand what he felt. But soon, everything would come to light. And the truth she had tried so hard to hide, was about to be revealed. Daniel's silence stretched on for weeks. There were no confrontations, no tears, no shouting, but his absence was piercing. And Laura, who had previously pretended not to understand, began to feel the weight of every word he left unsaid, every look he failed to hold, every gesture that no longer occurred. Breakfast was made, but never shared. The bed was shared, but never shared by both. The questions were limited to the basics, and the answers came dry and measured. Daniel wasn't an explosive man. He was the kind who knew how to kill a love with elegance. And Laura began to suffocate inside her own home. One Sunday morning, she tried to break the ice. She told him she missed him, that they were distant, that she felt something strange between them. Daniel just looked at her and replied with a calmness that hurt more than anger, "Do you miss me, or what I was when it was just you and me?" The question hung in the air like a slow poison. Laura tried to touch his hand, but he discreetly pulled away. It was this kind of refusal that hurt her most, the silent refusal, the emotional absence that spoke louder than 1,000 accusations. She knew he knew. But she didn't know how far he had gone. And it ate away at her insides. One night, Laura came home to find the living room dark except for the kitchen light. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and the muffled sound of old music filled the room with an uncomfortable nostalgia. Daniel was sitting at the table, an envelope in his hand. When she entered, he looked up, steady, and asked her to sit. Her heart raced. She sat down slowly, trying to maintain her composure. He pushed the envelope toward her but said nothing. When she opened it, she found some photos. Photos taken by someone who was clearly close enough to see, but far enough away not to be noticed. They were photos of her with another man. Some in restaurants, others on nights out, one in particular, taken from inside a car, showed her holding his hand, smiling like she hadn't smiled with Daniel in a long time. She tried to say something, but Daniel interrupted her. He said he didn't want an explanation. That he didn't need justifications. That what was there was just what he already knew. But there was something she needed to know, something that would change everything. He got up, went to the bedroom, and returned with a small box. He placed it on the table and stared at it. Laura hesitated, but opened it. Inside was a bracelet. Not just any bracelet. It was the same bracelet she'd lost months ago, a gift he'd given her on their 4th anniversary. He said he'd found the bracelet in the glove compartment of his car weeks ago, along with a handwritten note. The note wasn't hers. It was from the other guy. A thank you for another unforgettable night, and a sly taunt, "It's good to know she doesn't miss home." Laura closed her eyes. The air seemed thicker, the sounds around her more distant. She wanted to speak, wanted to apologize, wanted to say that none of this was what she truly wanted. But Daniel didn't give her any space. He said what hurt most wasn't the fact that he'd been betrayed, but the way she'd replaced him without remorse. How she'd managed to smile at him and someone else at the same time. How she'd made dinners feigning normalcy after nights spent sleeping on another chest. He said he felt like a dead man living beside her. That she'd taken from him not only his love, but the dignity of being the last to know. Laura cried. The tears flowed uncontrollably. She tried to touch him, but he recoiled. He said her touch no longer reached him. That there was no longer a home for that love. And then, after long minutes of silence, she asked the question that made him stop walking toward the door, "Do you still love me?" He looked into her eyes, for what seemed like an eternity, and answered, "I still love who you were. But I can't love who you've become." She fell to her knees, sobbing. She begged for a second chance. She said the other man meant nothing. That it had all been a mistake. That she missed who she was with him. That she didn't know why she did what she did, but she knew that nothing, absolutely nothing, hurt more than losing him. Daniel took a deep breath, sat down again, and, for the first time since it all began, told how he felt. He spoke of the pain of watching the woman he loved drift away day after day, the silent humiliation of realizing he'd been replaced, the loneliness within a relationship that no longer existed. He spoke of the sleepless nights, the cold dinners, the forgotten birthdays, the broken promises. He said he remained silent because he still had hope. But hope, like everything in life, also dies when fueled only by absence. And now, there was nothing left to save. Laura stood up, walked over to him, and begged for one last look, one last gesture, something to show he still believed in her. Daniel smiled, his eyes brimming with tears, and said he'd already forgiven her. But not for her. For him. Because carrying a grudge is like carrying the weight of those who hurt you. And he wanted to move on unburdened. He wanted to move on whole. She collapsed to the ground, hugging her knees. Daniel got up and left. Without shouting. Without saying goodbye. Without looking back. What Laura didn't know, and what she was about to discover, is that the emptiness she felt wasn't just the loss of Daniel's love. It was something much bigger, much crueler. Because what she thought was love, what she believed was freedom, was just a misplaced mirror of her own loneliness. And the man she threw everything away for, never had any intention of staying. But that, she would only find out when it was too late. Very late. That same night Daniel left for the last time from the house they called home, Laura sat on the living room floor for hours, unable to move. The kitchen light was still on, the forgotten song playing on her phone, the shards of what was left of their love scattered in the air, and she was there, unable to get up. Something inside her burned, not just guilt, not just regret, it was the deep, brutal, and sudden realization that the point of no return had been crossed. There was no longer a voice to call him back, no longer an embrace to bring him home. She hadn't just betrayed Daniel, she had betrayed herself, and now, even if she begged in every known language, there was no language he wanted to hear from her. In the days that followed, Laura tried to piece together her routine, but everything hurt. His absence was evident in every corner. His pillow remained untouched, the coat he always wore to go out on Sundays still hung behind the door. His scent had withstood the test of time. The silence that had once been suffocating now became unbearable. Laura began sleeping with the TV on just to avoid hearing the emptiness. She reached out to him twice, leaving short, respectful, almost desperate messages, but Daniel never responded. The man she had known, the one who had been constant, present, firm in his words, and calm in his love, was now nothing more than an absence filled with dignity. And it was destroying her insides. Unsure of where to turn, she sought the only place where she believed she still had some semblance of value, Eric's arms. The same man she'd gambled everything on. At first, he seemed receptive, as if he knew Daniel had left the path clear. He responded to her messages, arranged a dinner, and for a brief moment, Laura tried to convince herself that she could still make that choice feel right. They met at a different restaurant this time. Eric seemed colder, more hurried, more direct. They talked about the basics. He didn't ask about Daniel, didn't ask how she was feeling, just talked about his work, about future plans that didn't include her, about trips he'd take, events he'd organize. Laura tried to stay present, but she felt like she was talking to a stranger. And then, between glasses of wine, she took a chance. She told him that things between her and Daniel were over, that she was trying to start over, that maybe now they could experience something real. Eric just smirked and muttered something like, "I don't know if now is the time," cutting the conversation short with a comment about the food. That night, she slept alone. He didn't walk her home. There was no goodbye kiss, no promise to meet again. Just a quick wave, a curt, "take care of yourself," and the sound of the car door closing like the period of a poorly written sentence. It took Laura a while to understand what that meant. Or perhaps she understood immediately but resisted accepting it. Days went by without any message from him. When she tried to contact him, he didn't respond. A week later, she saw him, by chance, in a cafe with another woman. They were laughing. The woman was holding his hand, as she had done weeks ago. He saw her. He gave a slight wave, as if greeting a coworker, and then turned his attention to the woman in front of him. It was like a punch in the chest. The ground began to crumble beneath her feet. This wasn't a misunderstood love story. It was a mistake. A huge mistake. She hadn't traded Daniel for a fresh start. She'd abandoned the life she had for an empty fantasy. And now, she had neither the fantasy nor the life. She'd spent weeks trying to distract herself, but everything felt false. The invitations that had once been exciting now bored her. Her co-workers, who had previously seemed to admire her, now regarded her with a certain distance. And she knew why. This wasn't about moralizing. It was about coherence. And her incoherence had been too obvious to ignore. She began to feel a heaviness in her body, an emotional exhaustion that dragged her along. Nothing had taste, color, or meaning anymore. One night, after weeks of trying to resist, she went to the house where Daniel was living. She'd learned the address from a mutual friend, arrived unannounced, her hands sweaty and her heart in tatters. He answered the door with surprise. He looked different. His hair was slightly longer, a beard he hadn't had before, and his gaze was serene. He wore a simple t-shirt and held a book in his hands. Laura could barely speak. She simply said she needed to see him. That she needed to tell him how she felt. Daniel let her in. They sat in silence for a few minutes. She on the sofa, he in an armchair across the room. The atmosphere was tense. The memory of that last confrontation still lingered in both of them. Laura took a deep breath, her voice breaking, and confessed that she had made a profound mistake. She said she had let herself be carried away by the idea that she was losing something, when in fact she was destroying everything. She thought she needed to feel something new, when in reality she just needed to take better care of what she had. She said she thought Daniel would never leave her, and that this certainty had made her act arrogantly. Daniel listened in silence. And when she finished, he simply replied that he had already forgiven her, not because she deserved it, but because he deserved peace. And that now she was with someone who brought her exactly that. Laura froze. She swallowed. She asked if he was in a new relationship. Daniel hesitated for a second, then confirmed. He said he'd met someone at a cafe, by chance, a few weeks after he left home. They'd talked for hours, met again, and that, unintentionally, he'd allowed himself to feel something different. He said it didn't start as an escape, nor as revenge. It started as relief. And then as care. And then as love. And now, he was at peace. Pain gripped Laura's entire body. But she didn't scream, didn't cry. She just nodded, as if she understood the sentence. She wanted to ask more, but she had no right. He stood, walked her to the door, and before she left, he added, "We always think that what we have will wait for us to resolve our doubts. But sometimes, while we decide whether we love each other, the other decides they don't want to suffer anymore." She left with her chest shattered, the night cold beating hard on her face. She walked to the car feeling as if she'd been stripped of everything. He returned home and cried himself to sleep. He dreamed of old smiles. He woke with the memory that they would never be his again. Time passed. And over time, Laura discovered the true weight of loneliness. Not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that comes from having been responsible for the other person's absence. She saw photos of Daniel with his new wife. She saw the sparkle in his eyes. A sparkle that, one day, had been sparked by her. She realized that everything she had built with him had been real, but it was also past. And the present, now, belonged to someone else. She tried to move on, tried to reconnect. But no new beginning could sustain the weight of old choices. No new perspective could make her forget what she had lost. And the cruelest thing of all is that, over time, she realized she had spent so much time searching for something she thought was missing, that she failed to see what she already had in abundance: love, loyalty, peace. She traded all of this for desire. And when the desire passed, only emptiness remained. Daniel, for his part, rebuilt himself in silence. He didn't forget what he experienced with Laura, but he learned to look at the past with gratitude, not pain. He moved on with another woman, someone who respected him, admired him, made him laugh lightly and sleep peacefully. And when, by chance, he ran into Laura again months later, he greeted her politely but without emotion. She, with teary eyes, apologized once more. He smiled and replied, "I forgave." But only to close what still hurt. Not to reopen what's already over. And in that moment, Laura understood. She understood what she'd lost. She understood what she'd caused. She understood what would never return. And the most painful part wasn't forgiveness. It was realizing that, this time, he no longer hurt. And that she was no longer part of his story. She was just a closed chapter, and forgotten by those who had learned to love again. Laura left that last conversation with Daniel as if returning from a funeral, not of someone, but of herself. There was absolute silence within her, and even though outside the world continued to be noisy, with horns honking, hurried footsteps, and people going about their daily lives in a hurry, inside her, everything was suspended, paralyzed. Time had split in two, the time before he moved on and the time after, when she was left alone with her own conscience. For days, she wandered the house like a shadow, opening drawers that no longer held anything, touching memories as if she could revive them. She realized, with a cruel delay, that the most acute pain was not the loss of Daniel itself, but the fact that he now belonged to a story she wasn't a part of. And there was no room for her, not even as a good memory, because what she caused weighed so deeply that even the beautiful things ended up being tainted. The new woman he'd met wasn't just someone who made him happy. She was someone who had been there for him when he needed her most. A silent presence who didn't demand a place, but rather earned it. She discovered this unintentionally, overhearing snippets of conversations with acquaintances, catching details in posts, noticing in his eyes the kind of tranquility he'd never felt while trying to keep his relationship with her afloat. Laura felt it like a knife slowly sinking in. She was no longer home. Never would be again. The world seemed to have reorganized itself without her, as if her absence had been quickly replaced by something better. And, in a way, it had been. The consequence of her choices wasn't abandonment, it was replacement. And this kind of loss hurts differently, because it strips away the false idea that one day they might return. Amidst this raw grief, she began attending therapy sessions. She tried to understand what had driven her to destroy what she now knew was rare. The therapist confronted her precisely and harshly at times, helping her see that her search for novelty, for something to lift her from her sense of stagnation, was actually an escape from herself. She had never learned to sustain love in the low. She confused intensity with happiness, believing that for something to be real, it needed the impulse of the new, the adrenaline, the doubt. With Daniel, love was too stable, too secure, too certain, and this made her feel like it might not be true love. But now she knew that this was what every woman dreamed of finding. And she threw it away. The days passed with an almost sadistic slowness. She continued going to work, frequenting the same places, seeing the same people, but everything seemed to have changed in tone. People, even those who welcomed her, looked at her with a mixture of pity and restrained judgment. No one said it directly, but everyone knew. They knew about the betrayal. They knew she had lost Daniel. They knew he was in another relationship. And they knew she still hadn't managed to move on. One day, a coworker, unaware of how much her words would hurt, casually mentioned that she had run into Daniel and his new girlfriend at a restaurant, and that he seemed radiant, lighter, more open. Laura smiled politely, but upon returning home, she vomited in the bathroom because it had made her stomach churn so much. That was it. He was fine. And she, despite all her efforts, remained a wreck. She began to reflect on what true love truly was. She realized that love isn't about constantly feeling ecstatic, but about having someone who stays when the world seems to fall apart. And Daniel had been that for her. Someone who stayed. Who listened. Who tried. Who waited. And who, even when hurt, had enough empathy not to hurt her back. And now that he was with someone else, there was no desire for revenge in his demeanor, no display of superiority, nothing that indicated he wanted to make her pay. He had simply followed. And this indifference was the most painful punishment. Because when someone ignores you, it's because they've outgrown you. But when someone outgrows you with tenderness, it's because they've forgiven you. And forgiveness, in certain cases, is what kills forever. On the days she tried to leave, Laura found herself surrounded by empty men. Shallow conversations, predictable intentions, impatient looks. None of it filled the space Daniel had left. The problem was that the space wasn't physical, it was existential. No new gesture of affection could erase the memory of the care she had given and scorned. She began writing letters she never sent. Texts in which she poured out everything she felt, everything she remembered, everything she wished she could erase. She kept these letters in a box at the back of her closet, as if there she could control what she couldn't forget. Sometimes, I wrote to him. Other times, she wrote to herself. And some nights, he wrote to the woman who now occupied the place that had once been his, wondering if she knew how lucky she was. One of those nights, after rereading one of the letters, Laura decided to visit her mother. She hadn't spoken about Daniel with her in months, avoiding the subject. But that night, she needed to hear another voice that knew her deeply. They sat in the kitchen, drank wine in silence, and then Laura told her everything. She recounted the beginning of the estrangement, the affair with Eric, the fall, the attempt at rapprochement, the discovery of Daniel's new love. Her mother listened in silence. When she finished, she waited a few seconds and said something that completely shattered her. You loved Daniel so much, and that's exactly why you lost him. Because the love you felt for him wasn't enough to fill the void inside you. Laura cried like a child. And she cried not because of the words, but because she understood they were true. It was at this point that she began to accept that their story was over. Not by chance. But by responsibility. That love alone cannot bear the weight of neglect. That even the most faithful, the most patient, the calmest, leave when the other's absence becomes a presence of pain. And she had been too much absence. She had become blinded by her own dissatisfaction. And now, she saw everything too clearly. As the months passed, the pain began to settle. It didn't go away. It never goes away completely. But it became less pronounced. Laura dedicated herself more to therapy, started a new course, and started painting again in her spare time. She learned to embrace silence as a space for reconnection, not as punishment. She learned to be alone without feeling rejected. She began to rebuild herself, not to return to who she was with Daniel, but to become someone deserving of the kind of love she once had. Someone who, if you ever love again, won't let the essentials slip through your fingers. A year passed. And one cloudy afternoon, walking through a local fair, she saw him. Daniel, walking hand in hand with the woman who was now his partner. They were laughing at something silly, sharing popcorn, walking slowly as if in no rush to get anywhere. Laura stood still for a few seconds, unsure whether to hide or approach. But he saw her. And with the same lightness as always, he smiled from afar and nodded. There was no coldness. There was no awkwardness. Just a calm recognition of two paths that had once been one, but now headed in different directions. She smiled back, and in that gesture there was something new. There was pain, yes, but there was also acceptance. He knew he couldn't change what he'd done. But now he knew, with all his soul, the value of never repeating the same mistakes. Because betrayal doesn't just kill the other person. It kills the purest part of the person who commits it. And some deaths are irreversible. But Laura still had life. And with it, the chance to write a new ending. An ending that hasn't yet arrived. But this time, it will be deserved. Whatever it may be. Laura began to see her days as a sequence of small emotional tests. It was as if each moment demanded a different strength from her, getting up, getting dressed, smiling in meetings, dealing with questions about the past without letting the pain show on her face. The world around her seemed to move at a regular pace, and no matter how hard she tried, she still walked at an irregular pace, as if her body had learned to live but her soul was still relearning to breathe. Some nights were still heavy, and others, quietly bearable. But there was a subtle difference now. She no longer expected Daniel to return. She no longer harbored fantasies of reconciliation, no longer idealized emotionally charged reunions. Accepting had been the most painful step, but also the most liberating. Accepting not only that the love was over, but that it was now experienced by someone else, with a different intensity, in another story of which she was no longer a part. She began to examine her own decisions more closely, not as a form of self-punishment, but as an exercise in clarity. Everything she'd experienced with Eric, the entire relationship built on the shaky foundation of desire and dissatisfaction, now seemed almost absurd. She tried to imagine what would have happened if she'd broken up with Daniel before getting involved with another man, if she'd been honest enough to admit the crisis instead of seeking excitement elsewhere. But these hypotheses, no matter how many times they surfaced, brought no comfort. The past cannot be rewritten. And perhaps this is the great human tragedy, to understand deeply only after everything has been lost. The cruelest thing about her memories was realizing that Daniel hadn't become a different person after her, he'd simply blossomed with someone who truly watered him. And that was unbearably fair. On a cold autumn afternoon, Laura went to visit her father, who lived far away, in a simple house surrounded by trees and silence. The two hadn't seen each other in months, and their reunion was a kind of mirror. Her father was a reserved man, and even with his daughter, he always used few words, but looked deep into her eyes when he spoke. They sat on the porch, and she told him everything, the story with Daniel, the betrayal, the separation, his new life. He was silent for a while, then commented, "We think great losses come with an explosion. But they usually arrive in the interval, in the things we don't even realize we're giving up. And before you know it, what was solid has already turned to dust." Laura didn't answer. She just felt it. And he took that phrase with her as a reminder that some losses don't make noise, but leave holes that time cannot fill. It was that same month that Laura received an invitation to a local art exhibition, where some of her paintings would be displayed. It was the first time in a long time that she would allow herself to show something of herself publicly. He got involved in the preparation as a way to focus on something that was his alone, without memory, without ties to the past. On the night of the exhibition, he felt his heart race as he saw people standing before his paintings. Each color, each stroke, was a silent translation of the pain she had felt, of the absences she had tried to name with paint. At the end of the night, already tired and ready to leave, he heard a familiar voice calling her. He turned and, with his heart giving an involuntary leap, saw Daniel's sister. The last time they had spoken was before the separation, and the reunion was awkward at first. But the woman approached with a gentle smile, hugged Laura carefully, and said, "I saw your name on the invitation and wanted to come. I thought it was time." Laura was speechless for a moment. Daniel's sister was someone she had always cared for, and now, standing before her, she felt small. The woman looked around and, after observing one of the darker paintings, murmured, "You look different. Stronger, maybe. More real." Laura simply nodded. As the other woman turned to leave, she paused for a second and said, "He's fine. Happy. And he doesn't hold a grudge against you. But, you know that, right?" The sentence echoed for hours. Not as something hurtful, but as something sealing. Daniel had truly moved on. And so had the people around him. The following weeks were marked by a silent transformation. Laura stopped visiting Daniel's social media profiles, deleted old photos, and returned the wedding ring that was still stored in the box in the closet. She began taking long walks alone, without headphones, simply listening to her own thoughts. She began cooking for herself, taking care of the house with more attention, like someone caring for a temple that needs to be cleaned before being rebuilt. Sometimes I cried, of course. But the tears were no longer of despair. They were of respect for my own pain. I no longer wanted to erase the past, but I also no longer wanted to live in it. I was learning to treat the scar as part of my body, not as an open wound. One day, she received an unexpected invitation to speak at an event about personal new beginnings. Someone had read an article she'd published anonymously on a blog about emotional experiences and new beginnings, where she discussed self-sabotage, loss, and emotional reconstruction. The idea of sharing her story made her feel a bit uncomfortable, but she accepted. During the talk, with the microphone in her hands and the warm stage light on her face, she didn't talk about Daniel or Eric. She spoke about choices. About how the rush to feel something different can rob us of what was essential. About how the lack of listening within ourselves leads us to cry out in the wrong places. And about how loving someone is, above all, knowing how to love yourself honestly. At the end of the presentation, a woman approached, overcome with emotion, and said she was about to leave a relationship she considered lukewarm, but now realized the problem might not be with the other person. She said she would return home and talk to her husband, truthfully, courageously, and with presence. Laura hugged her and felt that, even in her pain, she had created something good. A movement, an awareness, a possibility to prevent others from making the same mistake she had made. It was as if she was beginning to give back to the world what she had learned in the most painful way possible. Later, as she left the auditorium, she was surprised by a light drizzle and a light wind. She walked alone to her car, feeling, for the first time in a long time, whole. Not healed, not ready, but whole. She knew it would still take time before Daniel's name stopped hurting, until another person's touch stopped making her think of comparisons. But she also knew the worst was over. And that now, all that would come would be construction. Even if slow. Even if lonely. Even if uncertain. Her reunion with Daniel at the fair, weeks before, had left a silent mark. She mentally revisited that nod and wondered if, on some level, he still felt something. But not because she wanted him back. Rather, because, no matter how many cycles end, there's always a trace of feeling that lingers in stories that were once real. And theirs was. Therefore, she kept that gesture as a symbol that, despite everything, there was respect. And respect, when love dies, is what prevents memory from becoming a battlefield. The pain still lingered. In small ways. Seeing a couple embracing on a park bench, hearing a song that played when they were together, entering a restaurant they used to go to. But over time, these pains stopped being daggers and became whispers. Signs that, even if she had destroyed something beautiful, she still had the capacity to learn, to recognize, to mature. And, most importantly, to not repeat it. She still didn't know if a new love would come. She was in no rush. She had understood that love isn't about chasing butterflies, it's about tending the garden. And now, after everything, she was finally clearing the land, removing the thorns, preparing the soil. No longer for someone else. But for herself. And maybe, one day, someone will come, not to fill the void, but to share the space. Meanwhile, Laura learned to stay. Not with someone else. But with herself. And this, after everything she'd been through, might be the true beginning. The start of a story still being written. A story in which, this time, she wouldn't be the villain or the victim. She would simply be the author. And that changed everything. Months after the exhibition and lecture, Laura received an offer to work in another state. It was a bold project, something that would challenge her professionally like never before, but also require a complete change in her life. The decision wasn't immediate, but it grew within her as something inevitable. For a long time, her steps had seemed to be moving in circles, between streets too familiar, memories that appeared at every corner, familiar voices that, even unintentionally, kept her trapped in the same narrative. She accepted the challenge not as an escape, but as an act of courage. I needed, for the first time since the end, to create a new story that didn't have roots tainted by guilt or loss. She left her old house, sold almost everything she owned, took only the essentials, and set out with a single goal, to truly start over, without any lingering issues with the past. In her new city, she found a different routine, lighter, but also quieter. She began meeting new people, but this time, with a different perspective. She wasn't seeking to be loved quickly, nor was she rushing to fill spaces. Laura had understood that the rush to fill emotional holes is what leads many people to make decisions that cost them dearly later. She exchanged messages with a few coworkers, went out for occasional coffees, but slept alone, without the feeling of being incomplete. For the first time, she could be self-sufficient. Emotional growth came like a silent avalanche. Laura became more empathetic, more truthful, more aware. And with that, more beautiful. The beauty that now emanated from her was no longer the vanity of desire, but the elegance of someone who faced pain, learned from their mistakes, and chose to move forward with dignity. Her longing for Daniel still existed, but now it lived in a more mature place within her. A space that respected what had been, but didn't desire its return. Daniel, for his part, had firmly established himself with his new partner. It wasn't an explosive relationship, full of dramatic promises, nor an attempt to erase the past. It was a real construction, based on partnership, listening, and truth. He was no longer the same man Laura knew. The pain had transformed him, but without making him bitter. He became more selective, more present, more grounded. The new woman, with her sensitivity, was able to reach parts of him that had previously been closed off. She didn't ask for space, she didn't force her presence. She gradually became more gentle. And Daniel, even wounded by everything he'd experienced, allowed himself to be there again. This relationship didn't erase the previous one, but it proved that love can blossom even after a fall, as long as there's truth in intentions and peace in touch. They were together now, making plans, respecting each other's rhythms, and that was enough. Eric, the man who once seemed to be the gateway to a new life for Laura, reaped the rewards over time. After several shallow relationships, he became shunned by many. His image, once seen as charismatic, became associated with someone volatile, superficial, incapable of committing to anything beyond his own ego. He lost some important connections at work, saw doors slowly close, not out of revenge, but as a natural consequence of the way he treated other people's feelings as disposable accessories. One day, he tried to reconnect with Laura, via text, lightly, as if nothing had happened. She saw him, but didn't respond. Not out of contempt, but out of understanding. She finally understood that this man never had the depth to accompany her on the path she was now treading. And that lack of response, for him, was more painful than any response. Because the silence of someone who has matured weighs much more heavily than any loud rejection. Life followed its course for everyone, as it always does. And each of them found themselves in different places, with new versions of themselves, some better, others still in process. But one thing was certain, what had been experienced between Daniel and Laura could never be erased. Nor should it. It was part of a real story, one that hurt, taught, and transformed. And like every true story, it left its mark. Not scars that deform, but those that firmly remind us that some choices require emotional responsibility. That cheating is not just a physical act, but a moral and emotional rupture that shatters the most sacred thing between two people, trust. Laura learned the hard way. Daniel did too. But they both moved on. Years later, by chance or a twist of fate, they met in a small bookstore while traveling. She was leafing through a book of poems when she heard his voice ask the clerk about a specific author. They didn't see each other immediately. It was one of those moments when time seems to stop for a few seconds before deciding what will happen. When their eyes met, there was a heavy, but painless, silence. Just the calm recognition of two people who no longer belong to each other, but who know exactly what they were to each other. They talked for a few minutes, like acquaintances sharing a beautiful but distant memory. He mentioned that he was moving to a smaller town, seeking more tranquility. She said she was involved in social projects and felt fulfilled. They laughed, wished each other the best, and parted with a short, respectful hug. After he left, Laura sat on the bench near the bookstore window and stood there for a few minutes, watching the street scene. She didn't cry, she didn't tremble, she didn't feel anguish. She just smiled. Because she understood that true forgiveness doesn't happen when someone tells you they forgive you. It happens when you face everything that destroyed you and realize it no longer dominates you. That the pain has passed, that the guilt has become a learning experience, and that love, even lost, has left you a stronger, truer, and more self-aware version. If you've made it this far, you were certainly touched by this story. Now we want to know, what did you think? Do you believe Laura deserved a second chance? Did Daniel do the right thing by moving on with someone else? And you, have you ever experienced something similar? Comment below, we'd love to hear your opinion. And of course, if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and don't miss any of the upcoming stories, which, like this one, are created to move, reflect, and transform. This story leaves us with a powerful message: betrayal destroys much more than trust. It breaks up homes, shatters the purest bond between two people, and often kills a love that could last a lifetime. All because of an impulsive choice, a lack of communication, an escape from oneself. May this story serve as a mirror for many. May it show, with rawness and beauty, that betrayal is not just a mistake, it's a decision that exacts a high price. And, almost always, those who betray pay with the loss of what they can never have again, the respect and sincere love of someone who only wanted to stay. And as we always remind you here, this channel does not support, encourage, or romanticize any kind of betrayal. Our stories are fictional, but their impact is real, because they reflect situations that happen every day, and that leave deep scars on those who experience them. Thank you for following us until the end. And until the next story.